You'll understand, Richard. The house belongs to me now. My aunt says it as if she's confirming a forecast. She slides a folder toward me. The notary stamp shines. My name is gone. I don't argue. I let the top page fold, then flatten. She mistakes the quiet for surrender, as she always has. You're in the city, she adds, bright and tidy. You don't need a decaying cabin. Cabin is the wrong word. My father called it a house when it was only holes for footings and a stack of stubborn lumber. I remember the hammer handle heating in my palm, the coffee can of nails. The first time the roofline cut a clean angle against the sky. A place can bank a life. That house holds his. Thank you for telling me. I say, and leave. Outside, winter has pared the street to brick, wind, and a shovel somewhere down the block. The lake house presses at the back of my mind. Pine smoke, wet rope, the specific metal taste of morning on the dock. I could wrestle with a woman who worships victories. Or I can build. I have always built. At home, I clear my table. Receipts, photographs, repair invoices with my signature, dock permits in my handwriting. A ledger page in my father's square script. Retitled to Halden Family Trust, 50/50ths, Richard and Marion. Brown ink. Hard fact. I brew coffee that tastes like iron and draw a rectangle on a yellow pad. Inside it, I print, quiet title. I am not a lawyer. I am a man who reads instructions before he picks up a tool. I lay a ruler on the page and draw a second box. Witnesses, receipts, maps, photographs, dates, all the dull bricks that make a wall. Rage is gasoline, records are mortar. I prefer walls that stand after the flame and smoke. Dawn is thin when I ease onto the highway. Pines thicken, snow shoulders the road, and the lake appears between trees like a coin under frost. The house sits back from shore at the angle I insisted on as a boy. Sightline, my father said. Following my finger on a paper window, I slid 2 inches. Praise arrived rarely. When it came, it was the right size. The porch boards recognize my weight. I still have a key. The lock thinks, then yields. Inside, ash and lemon oil. The clock above the mantel is stopped at 2:17, earnest in its uselessness. Her luggage stands in the hall, hard cases with stickers, a soft bag gaping. She means to occupy. Names can be moved. Chairs can be moved. The telephone table still holds the ledger. I photograph the trust entry. I do not pocket the book. The house owns it. I own the copy. On the back porch, the lake thinks under ice. A fox prints the far bank like careful handwriting. Across the cove, a glass box has replaced the fisherman's shack. Time rearranges furniture. Water keeps the view. A car door snaps. Voices my aunt's, bright. A man's, careful. She comes into the kitchen mid-sentence, as if room should listen. And the judge adores the view. Oh, Richard. I kept the kettle, I say. The burner clicks. A small fire does its work. She produces another document. This clarifies my sole authority. Your signature shows you won't interfere. It's reasonable. Reasonable is the word people pick when they're handing you a smaller plate, I read. The parcel number is wrong by 1 digit. Her lawyer, Ernest, coat too slim for snow, flushes pink when he notices that I notice. Template mistake, he says. The intent is clear. Intent is for toasts, I say, sliding the page back. Deeds are built with numbers. Steam softens my glasses. She declares exhaustion and carries her untouched cup upstairs, as if it were proof. The lawyer follows, arguing clauses to her back. Alone, I write notes. Their arrival time, the wrong digit, his name from the card he left. I underline estoppel by deed, not because I own it yet, but because I will. I sketch the shoreline and mark the boundary stone you can find with your boot if you know where to scuff the moss. Witnesses are beams. Paper is plaster. Hold weight with the first and finish with the second. Snow begins at night. I fix the pantry hinge because I cannot abide a hinge that size. Upstairs, one board complains in the guest room the same board every winter. The house greets me in its language. I answer by listening. Morning is milk white. In town, the recorder's clerk recognizes my father's name and remembers the donuts he brought when he filed anything important. We fish microfilm together. There it is, the trust language, tidy as an oath. A clause shines. Any transfer without notice to both beneficiaries is voidable. I photograph and print. Memory is also evidence. At the bank, I rent a safe deposit box. Copies go in. Originals go where only someone who loves lemon oil would search. Back at the house, my aunt wraps herself in my mother's blanket and calls the wood dreary. Wood is brown, I say. That's called honest. She waves away trees as a category. A contractor is coming. My guests prefer a contemporary. She waits to win an argument I don't enter. I ask if she wants more tea. She does not answer, which is her way of losing without admitting it. I draft a letter to her. As co-beneficiary and co-trustee, you must give notice. You must account. You must not encumber without consent. I cite the clause. I CC her lawyer. I prepare certified mail before I seal the envelope. Pressure wears its good shoes when it visits a person like my aunt. That afternoon she tours the rooms, issuing small decrees to no one. The portrait of my mother is cloying. The guest room is unacceptable. A draft is insulting. I oil the sash weights and the window answers with smooth travel. She thinks I am fixing things to avoid a fight. I am reminding the house who I am. At dusk I walk the shoreline. The lake sings its winter song long. Bowed notes in the ice. Across the cove, the glass box flickers. Glass returns whatever you project. Water returns what it believes. The lake has always believed me. Inside, I send a second letter to the county requesting the full chain of title and copies of filings for the last decade. I use the correct number. Chain is a useful word. Chains hold things together or hold them down. Either way, you learn where each link sits. The next morning, I visit the notary, whose seal appears on her papers. The log is clean, the ID's exact, the timing correct, no crooked rung to grab. Fine. You do not need a flaw when the larger frame is misaligned. On the way back, I stop at the hardware store. Weather strip, lamp oil, wax for the cords. The owner asks after my father with the unfancy respect men keep for other men. I nod and pocket the receipt. Even small slips of paper can be nails. My aunt schedules a dinner for Friday and lists her guests the judge, the banker, the friend from the paper, so I will hear the sound of her certainty. Certainty is noisy. I prefer permits. I drive to the neighbor across the point who still fishes through a square in the ice. He remembers helping us move the front window 2 inches for the afternoon line. He remembers the year. He agrees to write a statement. Truths choose their witnesses if you let them. When I return, the contractor is measuring rooms and proposing to brighten the envelope. I ask where the load paths fall. He blinks. My aunt waves a hand. We'll remove the wall and put an island, she says, as if she's discovered a country. I lay my palm on the wall and feel the old studs answer through paint, not without consequence. That night, the snow grows thick and obedient. I write a final letter for the week. Request for accounting, formal demand for notice, acknowledgement that any attempt to backdate corrections will be challenged. The sentences are beams. The certified mail slips are joist hangers. I lay them in a row and breathe easier. When the house quiets, I walk from room to room the way my father did on storm nights, touching corners, listening for complaints, tightening a screw here, a thought there. Upstairs, the guest room groans under my aunt's restless turn. Wood tells you what it intends to do if you listen. I take the keys from the bolt and weigh them. You can say a thing belongs to you. The way to make it true is slower. You care for it, you return its habits, you invite paper to agree with what Wood already knows. Before sleep, I stand at the window we moved all those years ago. The line of light still falls where my crooked ruler predicted. Snow ticks. The lake answers itself. Somewhere, a fox shakes free a paw and keeps going. Tomorrow, I'll watch the clerk stamp each envelope. The day after, I'll file my requests, log my calls, and begin drafting the petition whose language is a carpenter's square. Plumb, true. I will not hurry. I will not crow. I will measure twice and cut once. And when the cut is made, it will be so quiet you'll only hear the keys settling in my pocket. I was 12 the first time my father let me strike a nail into the frame of the lake house. It was 1958. A July afternoon so hot the boards burned the skin of my forearm when I leaned too long against them. My father's voice was steady in the dust. Don't rush the swing, Richard. Place it. He stood behind me, one hand on my shoulder, the other pointing where the nail sat between my fingers. The hammer rose and fell. The nail bent halfway. I flushed, ready to throw it out, but my father only nodded once. Straighten it. Try again. Mistakes stay in the wood, and so do corrections. Go. That board still rests in the north wall of the house. Even now, if I run my hand along the grain, I can find the faint scar where the nail once listed before I righted it. That was my first mark. The house carried it without shame. My aunt never touched a tool. Summers for her meant wide-brimmed hats and novels half read on the porch. She liked to tell stories about the mosquitoes as if they were the main feature of the lake, the nuisance she suffered with saintly patience. If she cooked, it was once a season. If she cleaned, it was by instructing me or my mother to fetch a rag. But she told everyone, the neighbors, the cousins, that the house was ours. Even as a boy, I knew that wasn't true. It was my father's sweat that set those joists, my mother's savings that paid for the shingles, and my hands, scraped and blistered, that learned the weight of work before I was old enough to vote. My aunt had her city apartment, her theater tickets, her weekend trips. The lake was her postcard, not her burden. I carried the burden. When I was 19, my father's back finally gave out. Years at the plant and weekends bent over, beams had cost him. I took leave from college that summer, driving out every Friday night to spend 2 days hammering, staining, and hauling. The roof leaked near the chimney. I patched it with tar. The dock planks swelled and buckled. I replaced them one by one. Sunday evenings, as I packed my bag to return to the city, my father would sit on the porch in his worn flannel shirt, a mug of coffee cooling in his hand. "You'll keep this place, Richard," he said once, watching the last light scatter across the water. "Your children will run across this porch just like you did." I believed him. I built my life on that belief. My children did run across that porch. They tracked sand inside and argued over who got the top bunk. They learned to fish off the dock, their small hands gripping rods as though the weight of a perch might pull them under. In winter, we skated on the frozen cove, breath clouds puffing, cheeks red from the wind. Each memory became a nail, a beam, a fresh coat of paint. The house was not just wood. It was proof that we belonged somewhere, proof that all my father's labor had a reason beyond wages. When my son took his first steps across those uneven floorboards, I told myself that 3 generations now had pressed themselves into this place. I imagined a 4th, maybe a 5th, if the house was cared for. Care that was always the measure. My aunt visited rarely. When she did, she complained. The beds were stiff, the kitchen outdated. She declared the water muddy compared to the bottled kind she preferred. She never saw the hours I spent under the sink replacing pipes, or on the ladder repainting shutters, or in the basement clearing mold. She saw only the view, and in her mind, a view belonged to whoever admired it most loudly. She liked to arrive unannounced, staying just long enough to be photographed on the porch with a glass of wine in hand. Later, at family gatherings, she would retell those visits as though she had been the one to open the house each spring, to sweep the cobwebs, to oil the hinges. People nodded. She was charming. She was good at claiming credit no one contested. I never corrected her. Not then. There is a kind of sacrifice that goes unnoticed because it is not dramatic. Mine was quiet, working Saturdays at the firm while my colleagues played golf, just so I could afford the property taxes my aunt forgot to split. Driving 4 hours after a week of late nights to mow the lawn and scrub the algae from the dock before my children arrived. I patched, repaired, repainted, and paid. Every check was a promise. Every weekend a deposit. She never noticed. Or she did, and preferred the silence of my endurance. Perhaps she thought silence meant I didn't care. But silence was my way of caring. The house grew older with me. Shutters loosened. I tightened them. The roof needed a second patch. I climbed the ladder, knees stiff, hands sure. The beams in the crawl space sagged. I braced them with jacks and new joists. Each task was a conversation with my father's ghost, his voice steady in my ear. "Don't rush the swing, Richard. Place it." I placed it. For decades, I placed it. And when my children grew older, when they began to scatter into their own lives, it was I who kept the place alive for their return. I stained the deck so their partners would admire it. I cleared the brush so their cars could park by the shed. I hung the lanterns on the porch so evenings would glow the way they had when they were small. I asked for nothing. My aunt asked for everything. When my father died, she wept loudly at the service, though she had not visited him once in his last year. At the reading of the will, she insisted she should manage the house since she understood the family's needs. I said nothing, because the papers were clear. The trust gave equal shares. My silence was not assent. It was the belief that fairness, written plainly, would hold. I was wrong. Fairness is only ink until someone decides to test it, she decided. She tested, and when the ink bled under her hand, she called it destiny. I think now of all the sacrifices I made for that house. The vacations not taken, the raises spent on repairs, the hours of labor when my back begged for rest. None of it was wasted, even if unrecognized, because every nail I drove, every brush stroke of paint, was proof of belonging. The house remembers me, even if her papers do not. When I walk its halls, the boards creak in greeting. When I sit on the porch, the railing fits my palm where I once sanded it smooth. When I step onto the dock, The planks answer with the rhythm of my father's hammer. My aunt can claim ownership, but she cannot erase memory. And memory is a sharper deed than ink. One summer evening, years ago, she had arrived in her usual storm of perfume and complaints. I was sanding the porch rail then, sweat dripping into the wood dust on my shirt. She wrinkled her nose. "You'll never get the varnish even," she said, lifting her sunglasses to inspect my work. "It's not for even," I answered. "It's for holding." She laughed, dismissing the point, and went inside. That phrase stays with me now. Holding. That was always the purpose. I held the house up. I held the family's promise when no one else did. I held silence when she claimed victories that weren't hers. And one day soon, I would hold the deed again. My sacrifices made me patient. Patience made me dangerous. Because when you've spent your life building quietly, betrayal doesn't drive you to rage. It drives you to rebuild, brick by brick, until what was stolen is yours again. My aunt had taken my share on paper, but every sacrifice I had made was still lodged in the beams, still humming in the walls. She lived in the guest room, under a roof patched by my hand, on floors I sanded, in the shadow of work she never lifted for. She thought she was mistress of the house, but the house knew better. And so did I. I could feel my father's voice pressing at me as I watched her carry her suitcase up those stairs the first night. "Don't rush the swing, Richard. Place it." I would place it. Carefully. Precisely. She had taken what she thought was hers. I would take back what I knew was mine. The betrayal didn't happen all at once. It was not a thunderclap or a slammed door. It was slower than that, like water leaking behind a wall, softening beams you thought would hold forever. By the time you notice the stain, the rot has already settled in. I should have seen it sooner. But trust blinds and family is the most dangerous blindfold of all. The first hint came in an envelope. A county notice, pale blue, slipped between bills. Property reassessment, it read in its stilted language. But the parcel number, our parcel number, was attached to her name alone. My name was absent. I held the letter over the sink, the paper softening with the steam of my untouched coffee. I told myself it was a clerical error. Governments misprint things every day. I called the office, spoke with a clerk whose voice sounded tired. "The deed shows sole ownership under Marion L. Halden," she said. "Filed last fall." Last fall. While I was crawling under the crawl space with jacks to keep the beams from sagging, while I was replacing the shingles she complained about, while I was paying the tax bill that arrived in my mailbox, she had been filing papers. I asked her about it at Thanksgiving. The family was gathered around her polished dining table in the city, turkey steaming, glasses full. I waited until the clinking of forks softened. "I got a notice from the county," I said quietly. "They list you as sole owner of the lake house." The fork froze halfway to her mouth. Then she set it down gently, wiped her lips with the cloth napkin, and smiled in that way of hers, slow, deliberate, as though she'd been waiting for the moment. "Oh, Richard," she said, "you signed the consent months ago. Don't you remember?" The room tilted, every cousin and nephew suddenly attentive. "No," I said, steady. "I never signed away my share." She widened her eyes, practiced surprise. "Well, maybe you forgot. You're so busy these days. I filed it with a lawyer, perfectly legal." The cousins nodded, some with sympathy, some with skepticism. To them it was a story told over turkey. To me it was the hollowing of decades. She had erased me, and she'd done it publicly. Later that evening, as coffee cooled in front of us, she leaned close, her perfume sharp enough to cut. "You can huff and puff, Richard, but the house is mine. I've already spoken with the judge. He agrees. Let's not embarrass ourselves." The judge. I knew which one her bridge partner, the man who once spilled scotch on the rug, and laughed about how these cabins should be turned into resorts. I realized then it wasn't a mistake. It was a design. She had planned it while sipping wine on the porch, while watching me haul firewood, while letting me pay the bills. She had smiled at me, even as she drew up the papers to erase me. That is the nature of betrayal. The knife is already in your back before you feel the handle. The following months were a campaign of humiliation. She told the family I had graciously stepped aside. She bragged to neighbors that she was finally free to make the place shine. She hosted small parties at the house, posting photographs of herself on the porch in dresses too fine for the pine boards beneath her feet. Every photo stung, not because she was in them, but because the house looked captive behind her smile, like a child forced to pose with a stranger. I drove out one weekend to find her on the dock with a realtor, pointing at the shoreline as though she were Moses naming the tribes. She turned when she heard my boots on the boards. "Oh," she said, all innocence. "I thought you'd moved on." "Moved on. as though you can move on from your own skin. The realtor glanced between us, sensing tension but bound to his commission. She wrapped her arm through his and led him back toward the porch. I stood on the dock until the boards creaked, my hands fists at my sides. I did not shout. I did not demand. I watched. I listened. I noticed how she favored the guest room, my mother's old room, because the master creaked too much at night. I noticed how she kept the curtains drawn, too afraid of the lake's black water after sunset. I noticed how she hired cleaners from the city but never learned the quirks of the furnace, so the house sighed cold when snow fell heavy. She could parade, but she could not live in that house the way I could, and still, the deed said it was hers. The humiliation reached its peak that spring, at a family gathering she hosted at the lake. She made sure everyone saw the new brass plaque she nailed to the porch rail. The Marion Halden House, Est 1958. I stood at the edge of the yard, drink in hand, watching cousins pose for photos beneath it. They laughed, unaware of the theft beneath their feet. One nephew approached me, sympathy in his voice. "It must be hard, Uncle Richard, but at least it stays in the family, right?" I smiled without showing teeth. "Yes, it stays in the family." He walked away, satisfied, not realizing my words carried an edge he couldn't hear. That night, I walked the shoreline alone. The lake was restless, ice still cracking in the shallows. I remembered my father's words. "Mistakes stay in the wood, Richard. So do corrections." She thought she had rewritten the story. She thought her plaque could replace memory, her papers could replace sweat. But corrections endure too. I looked back at the house, its outline against the dark sky, the soft glow from windows I had glazed, the porch rail smoothed by my sanding. She had stamped her name on it, but the house didn't know her. It knew me. In betrayal, there is always a gift, though bitter. Her arrogance was her gift to me. She flaunted too much, spoke too loudly, boasted too early. She could not resist showing her victory to the world, and in her noise, she left cracks. Cracks wide enough for a patient man to slip through. She thought I was defeated, that I would lick my wounds and retreat. She mistook silence for surrender. Again. But silence was only the space where I measured, and I was measuring carefully. The betrayal burned, yes, but it also hardened me. No more benefit of doubt, no more waiting for fairness to reveal itself. She had shown me that family blood meant nothing if greed ran thicker. From that night on, I carried every humiliation like a stone. And stones, if you collect enough, can build something strong. A wall, a foundation, even a fortress. She thought she had cut me out. She had only sharpened me. The morning after she screwed her name into the porch rail, I drove home with the window cracked to let in pine and thaw. The highway unspooled in a gray ribbon, mile markers ticking like a metronome. I didn't turn on the radio. I needed the silence the way a carpenter needs a clear bench, room to lay out tools, room to measure without anyone clearing a throat and asking if I was sure. I have rarely felt sure at the beginning of anything. I prefer to become sure by building, one careful cut leading to the next. I began with the shoebox that keeps my life in receipts. It lived on the top shelf of my closet behind winter scarves, an ugly thing I had never thrown out. Inside was paper that had once been white and now had the tea color of old pine sap, nails, shingles, tar, joists, dock bolts. 2 gallons of stain from the summer the grandkids made handprints on the drop cloth, and I pretended not to notice. Every slip bore my name, my card, or my father's square initials on the oldest pages. I spread them across the kitchen table until the wood grain disappeared under proof. Photographs came next. Not the pretty ones she posted, the wine glass catching sunset, a borrowed hat on a borrowed head, but the work shots I never showed. Me under the crawl space with a jack and a headlamp. My son on the ladder while I steadied his knees. My daughter, 12 and fierce, sanding the rail with a seriousness she now saves for boardrooms. The pictures wore dust because they had earned it. I scanned them, labeled them, and wrote where and when and who took them. Her face appeared in maybe 3 photos, always with a drink in hand, never with a tool near her. When the light fell, I went to the library. County law shelves hum a particular note under fluorescent tubes, a patient chord for people who understand time better than adrenaline. I read until the Latin stopped sounding like ceremony and started sounding like ethics my father would recognize. Notice, joinder, estoppel by deed, constructive trust, quiet title, words that are tools if you hold them by the right end. I turned pages in cotton gloves, not to protect the books from me, but to keep myself from running too hot. What she had done wasn't clever. It was loud. Loudness convinces crowds. Ledgers don't listen. In the filings she had commissioned, The parcel number was wrong by 1 digit. The trust required notice to both beneficiaries before any encumbrance. My mailbox had been empty while hers overflowed with plans. The county file showed no proof of service to me. The signature page named 2 trustees and bore only one slanted signature, proud as a peacock's tail. Greed hurries. Hurry makes gaps. Gaps make entrances. The recorder's clerk knew my father's handwriting before she knew mine. He brought donuts when he filed the big things, she said, tracing a line he wrote in 1958 like a vein. She pulled microfilm, fed it into light, and there we were. My father's block letters, the trust amendment from the year I left for college, my mother's tiny notes in the margin. I ordered certified copies of everything and paid in cash. Cash leaves fewer echoes for people who gossip more than they read. The clerk stapled her seal down with the care of a person who understands paper can outlast stone if you treat it right. At the bank, the trust officer tried to drown me in calm. His desk had the fake wood grain of a set piece. I slid the claws across and watched the color leave his face. Yes, he said finally, small as a man hearing hail begin. Any action requires both trustees. He printed a letter that said so in syllables even a judge respects. I asked about the escrow where she parked the insurance check after the ice storm. He swallowed and said, "We will reconcile." I left him to learn the difference between presence and performance. Neighbors staff the truth better than committees. I walk the point to the old fisherman who winters here longer than any commissioner has held a gavel. He carries my father the way he carries his tackle, worn, useful, always in reach. "You and your pa raised that wall in a weekend," he said, pointing where the living room meets the kitchen. She never picked up a board. She picked up opinions. I asked if he would say that under a notary's seal. He said he would say it anywhere God could hear him and the county could write it down. The notary at the shipping store took our oaths and gave us stamps. The sound of a seal pressing down is a kind of music, a dull thump the body trusts. I stacked affidavits from 3 neighbors and the dock builder who remembered my checks clearing when her promises bounced. I added repair invoices, photographs with dates, tax payments, emails to contractors sent from my account while she was canning compliments in the city. I built a file thick enough to keep a door from closing. Truth can be thin on a stage. On a desk, it prefers weight. Her performances continued, naturally. Lights at the house on Fridays, delivered food, laughter strong enough to reach the cove. She hired a photographer to capture her against her lake. They arranged her on the porch steps my father and I rebuilt after the flood. She lifted a glass and tilted her chin in a way I recognized from 1,000 other rooms. People who live on stage forget that wood remembers who built it. From the trees, I watched the shutter stutter and thought about timing. A camera loves a moment. A deed loves a line. I hired a surveyor named Buckley, whose boots knew moss. He walked the boundary stones with me, while telling stories about lines that outlast families. We found the pin at the north corner under an inch of stubborn earth, and laughed like men who recover a lost screw inside a complicated engine. He drafted a fresh plat whose angles whispered truer than any speech, and attached a note about the scrivener's error in the earlier instrument, the digit that tilted everything by a false distance into someone else's confidence. He set his seal with the satisfaction of a man who enjoys being precise. At night, I prepared letters I would not send until the stack felt right. One to the recorder demanding correction under statute, one to the assessor to align their roles, one to the clerk of court to calendar the quiet title action, one to her attorney listing every defect no bluster could sand smooth. I used certified mail where I wanted green cards, and courier where I wanted eyes. I kept a log as tight as a blueprint, date, time, who signed, how delivered. Some men stacked firewood. I stacked evidence until the pile threw shade. When I finally called an attorney, I chose a young one with ink stains on his fingers and a patient face. He didn't interrupt. He separated. Evidence here, argument there, story everywhere, but never at the expense of fact. He read my file, slid his thumb along the affidavits, and said, "You've done most of this already." "I'm comfortable on ladders," I told him, "but I prefer someone else hold the bottom." He smiled the way I smile when a beam drops into exactly the pocket I cut. We spoke about venue and which judge would read without leaning on friendships that smell like scotch. We drafted the complaint like a roof frame that would not leak. Each count sat on a beam: breach of trust for failure to give notice, declaratory relief for the parcel correction, quiet title for a chain misfiled in a hurry, constructive trust for any value, siphoned while she called it caretaking. Exhibits were nailed like sheathing. Not so many that you waste time, not so few that a gust can get under and turn your work into a sale. He filed. I paid. The docket gave our effort a number. small as a seed and just as promising. I kept my voice low in town. I did not recruit allies in bars or wave papers in markets. I nodded at the clerk, thanked the woman answering phones, brought no donuts, promised no favors, asked for nothing we hadn't earned. A place like this remembers who behaves like a neighbor and who arrives only to secure applause. My aunt made her need for an audience the core of her standing. I made the absence of one the spine of mine. If justice must knock, it should arrive without a trumpet. Doors open easier for quiet hands. At the house, I made small, public corrections she could not criticize without insulting herself. I cleared the gutters. I sanded the splinter that snagged her scarf last fall. I tightened the post bracket until it stopped groaning winter's memory. When her contractor came to brighten the envelope, he asked where the load ran. I tapped the post and the beam it married. Right there. He nodded and pretended he had known. People who call walls envelopes often treat weight like a rumor. The house prefers facts. She sent me texts that read like a play where the audience changes every scene. In one, she was gracious, asking whether we could put this unpleasantness behind us. In another, she scolded me for airing family laundry. Though the only air came from the docket and the breeze off the lake, once she threatened to sell, I reminded her she could not encumber what she did not own without both trustees, and even then only with a ledger the trust approved. Silence followed, clean as a swept aisle. Paper has a way of settling loud mouths. I kept walking the shoreline. In late afternoon, a loon carved a vowel into the water and left it there. The dock boards took my weight like a handshake, familiar and firm. I checked cleats for the storm season and swapped 2 bolts where rust had bragged too long. Work calms a man better than explanation. Explanation burns hotter and cools uglier. Across the cove, a new glass house mirrored its owner. Water keeps the view, glass keeps the pose. I prefer water. It tells the truth even when it tries to look like something else. I visited the notary, whose seal had blessed her earlier paperwork. The logbook was clean, the identification exact, the date correct. No crooked rung to grab. Fine. You don't need a flaw when the frame is misaligned. I thanked the notary for her time and drove back past fields, still holding winter in their furrows, thinking how often a straight nail is less useful than a true square. Some evenings I sat on the porch steps she had used as a stage and listened to the lake sound its slow breath. The house answered in timber. A pop, a sigh, a small expansion. Familiar syllables of a language I've spoken since boyhood. Houses forgive people who listen. My listening sharpened. I made a list of every habit the place remembered, where snow drifted, where wind nosed, which board complained in the guest room when an anxious person turned, which window wanted coaxing rather than force. I spoke with the assessor in person. We went line by line through a roll built up over decades like sediment. The wrong digit in the parcel number gleamed there, an offense small as a splinter and just as irritating. He corrected it while I watched. We mailed the notice to both trustees. His pen scratched the envelope with my name in ink darker than anything she had ever used. Small acts shift foundations when placed correctly. The survey plat arrived with Buckley's neat signature and the weight of someone who respects corners. I tucked it behind the complaint and felt the whole file settle into balance. My father's ledger page retitled to Halden Family Trust 50/50ths Richard and Marion went on top, not because courts require romance, but because men do. The square of his letters steadied me. He had believed in fairness written plainly. I had learned that plain fairness still needs a spine. We scheduled service with the sheriff for a morning when she would be in the guest room. I knew her calendar because performers broadcast it. The deputy was the same man who watched my son drag a sled up the hill when the lake froze enough to risk dignity. He said he would knock respectful and stay for coffee if I poured it in a chipped mug. Respect. Here, drinks from the cup it's given. I set 2 mugs beside the stove and ground beans like a ritual, steady and certain. Some mornings deserve the sound of a grinder more than the sound of a speech. On the last night before the papers were to meet her door, I sat at the kitchen table and put every document back in order. The complaint on top. Exhibits in sequence. Photographs in a sleeve that would not glare under courtroom lights. Affidavits with seals still proud. The bank letter. Buckley's plat. A copy of the ledger page where my father wrote the trust into being, his hand like the grain of oak. Straight, competent, clean. I closed the satchel and tested the zipper like a man checking the set of a blade. Then I went to the door and oiled the hinges so the knock would sound like a knock, not like trivia. I stood on the porch where her brass had pretended to belong and ran my hand over the filled holes. Nearly invisible under stain. If you didn't know to look, you wouldn't. I looked. I wanted to remember what arrogance leaves behind after you sand it flush, and forgive the board for carrying it. The lake breathed. The pines answered. Somewhere across the cove, a screen door yelped, and the sound folded back into the trees like a lesson completed. I walked to the end of the dock and listened to the water whisper back what men tell it when they think they are alone. The house behind me settled onto its sills and waited. Houses can wait longer than people. This one had waited through tempers and weather and richer invitations than mine. It had chosen, as much as lumber chooses, and I had answered. I slept on the couch by the hearth like a man on watch. Before dawn I woke, warmed my hands around a mug, and looked at the satchel that contained months of measured movement. The fabric ridge felt like the back of a good saw, worn smooth by work, teeth still right. I did not practice any speeches. Wood has taught me that persuasion is for people, structure is for truth. I stood in the smell of coffee and ash and lemon oil and counted: foundation, walls, roof, finish. Measure twice, cut once. Sand until the splinters stop speaking. Don't varnish over dust and call it shine. Just before 9, I stepped onto the porch and watched the road. Gravel holds history like a ledger holds debits. You can tell who comes and who goes by the way stones throw their sound. I heard tires and knew the weight before I saw the color. County green, then county blue. I lifted my hand and the deputy lifted his. Inside, the guest room board prepared its complaint. The clock chose its seconds. The lake lay its back down and promised to remain calm. I opened the door wide enough for truth to walk in without turning sideways. When the knock came, it sounded like a small, firm correction. Like a carpenter tapping a nail once more, not hard, just true. And although the scene that follows belongs to the next season of this quiet war, I can say this. The hinge made the sound a hinge makes when you oil it the night before. No squeal, no drama, no apology. Only the easy travel of something designed to move and now finally allow. That is how I wanted the countermove to feel. Not like a strike. Like a repair finished at last. The lake lay flat as a sheet of hammered pewter, the early light taking its time to decide where to sit. A weak wind sifted the pines, lifting a smell of thawing needles and damp soil. Somewhere in the reeds, ice cracked like a knuckle being flexed for work. Inside the house, the radiator ticked its small, persuasive metronome. I had slept on the couch by the hearth. Not for comfort, but for proximity close enough to hear the boards breathe, close enough to feel when the house exhaled. On the kitchen table waited the satchel. Complaint, exhibits, affidavits, the surveyor's plat with Buckley's careful lines, the bank officer's acknowledgement, the assessor's correction, the recorder's certified chain with my father's square handwriting reproduced like a blessing. The strap had worn a shine where my hand had worried it over months. I set my palm on the leather and felt the slow pulse of paperweight that doesn't waver under noise. Upstairs, the guest room board gave its familiar complaint. A turning body, a pause, a sigh. She liked that room because the master creaked too honestly for her sleep. Even the house had learned her preferences. Curtains drawn against night water, extra pillows to disguise a restless head, an aversion to the furnace's first cough. In a different life, I might have pitied that. This morning, I cataloged it as one more fact. She occupied a place she never understood. I stood on the porch with a mug and looked at the brass plaque she'd screwed into the rail. Her name, the year she'd chosen to pretend the house began, the way the screws bit slightly too deep into the wood. Frost had dusted the letters. It made the metal look like a stage prop forgotten after the curtain hollow, obedient to light, unable to hold heat. I pressed my thumb against one screw and imagined the small elastic squeal it would give when I turned it back out. Not yet, I told myself. One correction at a time. The tires reached me before the vehicles came into view. Wet gravel has a particular voice, a granular whisper that tells you more than tires mean to say. A pale county sedan, then the blue and white cruiser lights off, moving as if the road had asked them to be considerate. Doors opened softly. A man with a stack of papers, another in a uniform that fit like a statement. The deputy lifted his hat to me the way men here greet a known truth. I returned the gesture with the economy my father taught me. Don't use two motions when one will do. They reached the steps, and I let the storm door float shut behind me. The screen held the kitchen's lemon oil and last night's ash. The deputy nodded toward the kitchen, as if to ask whether the house was ready to be spoken to. I nodded back. He knocked with the knuckles of a working hand firm. No flourish, exactly the sound a door expects when it's about to be told the truth. She arrived a moment later, an arm cinching a robe that wasn't built for utility, hair loose, voice already angling for a higher court. "What is this?" she said, not to anyone in particular but to the air, which she assumed would rush to accommodate her. "Do you know what time—" "Good morning," the deputy said, hat against his jacket now. "Marion Halden?" She gave her name in full, polished and tall. The man with the papers adjusted the stack, read from the top page as if it were a map. Case number, caption, relief. He spoke the parcel number that had once been mistyped by a hurried hand. He pronounced each digit as if setting it down on a foundation. By order of the court, he said, title is quieted in favor of co-beneficiary Richard Halden, and a constructive trust is imposed on any proceeds arising from encumbrances undertaken without proper notice to both trustees. You are being served. For a breath, she tried on a smile. It didn't fit. Then, a small hinge noise escaped her throat. Ridiculous, she said. I spoke with Judge Phelps. He understands the situation. This can't be venue reassigned. The deputy answered with a courteous steadiness I admired. A different bench heard it. The order speaks for itself. Her eyes flicked to me then, finally, as if I had stepped out from behind a curtain I'd never been behind. You, she said, and made the word hold far more years than it deserved. You engineered this. You've been skulking through offices. I read what was written, I said, and I answered with what was true. She held the papers without looking at them, the way a person holds groceries they didn't mean to buy. The server extended a pen for her signature on the acknowledgement. Her hand shook just enough to make the flourish look accidental. She signed anyway. On her way past, the guest room board announced itself again, like a sworn statement from timber. Would you gentlemen like coffee? I asked. Because in a place that taught me law through fences and rivers, hospitality and enforcement can share a table. We would, the deputy said, and his voice softened half a degree. Black is fine. I poured into chip mugs that had seen more winters than some friendships. We stood in the kitchen, me, the deputy, the server with his clipboard, and did not make small talk. Above us, drawers slid, a zipper fought and yielded, phone calls went out like flares, and died, like sparks on snow. I need an emergency stay, I heard her say to one voicemail, the words crammed together as if speed could force an answer. Another call, tell Phelps, he said. This is absurd. A third, they're humiliating me. He's humiliating me. A fourth, the angry whisper people use when witnesses are too close. Richard, you cannot do this to me. I looked at the deputy over my mug. He raised his eyebrows the width of a nail. The clock on the mantel faltered, chose a second, and committed to it. I felt the house listening not for gossip, but for resolution. She came downstairs dressed and painted into composure. The papers now pinched at the edges like something she might return for a credit if she found the right manager. She set them on the table between us, as if their proximity to coffee could dilute them. I will contest, she said. I will appeal. I will host friends here next week and show them how ridiculous this is. You are welcome to host your friends anywhere, I said voice level, but you can't hold this house out as solely yours. The order makes that plain. The deputy nodded. We're here to keep the peace, he added, because that is what you do when someone tries to deputize spectacle. No one is being removed today. You may gather what you need. Mr. Halden has agreed you may remain a guest if invited, but legal control is corrected as of this morning. My house, she said, and the words sounded suddenly small in her mouth. Everyone knows what they're told, I said. The wood knows who sanded it. Something behind her eyelids faltered, a stage light blinking. For one bare instant, she looked like a person standing at the edge of a lake they've always admired from a porch, realizing they don't know how to swim. Then she straightened, gathered a suitcase, and swept up the staircase, trailed by a perfume that didn't belong to pine or ash or waxed cord. The men finished their coffee and left the mugs in the sink the way careful guests do. The deputy gave me a small nod at the door. You did the work, he said, neutral as a level. That tends to hold. When their engines dissolved into the trees, the house went quiet in a way that wasn't empty. It was the quiet of a tightened hinge, the quiet of a window that has been coaxed back onto its sash cords. Upstairs, the packing continued anger howled into fabric, phone calls turning into testimony for sympathetic ears who couldn't change an order. I wrote notes in my log the way I have always preferred to remember things. Date, time, names, what was said. People break when memory is only an emotion. Paper prefers facts. From time to time, I moved through the house with a rag and a small bottle of oil, touching what had complained in winter. The latch that used to click twice, the door that insisted on announcing itself. I tightened a strike plate, eased a sticky drawer, not because anything needed to be perfect for her exit, but because work is how I tell the house I'm listening. On the porch, I laid my hand again on the brass plaque. It had warmed under the light, but there was no heat inside it. The screws looked larger now that the order sat in the drawer with the deed a show of force that suddenly read as insecurity. I decided to leave it for the moment. Let her see it there, and understand that even her metal could be patient under my wood for a few more hours. Afternoon found her at the bottom of the stairs with a suitcase and several smaller angers. She paused near the photographs and practiced not seeing them. She paused at the mantel clock and pretended it wasn't keeping time again. At the threshold, she turned with a smile built like an emergency scaffold. "You'll be sorry," she said. "People will see what you've done to me." "I didn't do anything to you," I answered, "because there are sentences you give as gifts to your future self. You took what you thought you could. I corrected it. That's all." She held my eyes for a long moment, searching for an argument that would let her be large again. None arrived. She stepped onto the porch. The wind put its hand through her hair as if to return it to her the way it found it. She touched the edge of the plaque and let her fingers fall before they made a sound. Then she walked to the car, heels careful on the gravel, and left the way all performances leave, without admitting they're over. I carried the plaque to the shed not 10 minutes after her taillights disappeared. A driver with a conscience does not watch you fold a costume. Alone with the tools, I loosened the screws, one by one. Each gave a small, elastic sigh and agreed to leave. Underneath lay a rectangle of wood paler than its surroundings, a healed scar, a map of where something wrong had once been attached. I filled the holes with putty the color of patience and pressed stain across the surface with my thumb. If you didn't know to look, you wouldn't. I know to look. That's enough. Inside, I placed the order in the drawer with the house papers. The old deed in my father's hand, the plat with Buckley's initials, the letter from the bank, the assessor's correction. I didn't hide anything. Truth doesn't need to be hidden to remain true. I called the attorney and left a message he could translate into filings. Service completed, order delivered, possession clarified, no incident. I called the bank officer and the insurer, not to announce a victory, but to align facts. I called no one else. By evening, the light sank into the lake in long, orderly planks. I walked the shoreline. The stones the surveyor had refound were where they had always been. We had merely remembered them. Across the cove, a neighbor lifted a hand without question. That's the custom here. You greet a correction with acknowledgement, not commentary. Standing on the dock, I could smell the rope's old tar, the metals clean cold, something green waking under water. The house behind me shifted on its sills and settled, the way a body settles when it no longer braces for an injury that won't arrive. Back inside, I cooked something simple and ate at the kitchen table where the satchel had rested that morning. I noticed how the wood glowed in the lamplight now that the weight atop it had changed from preparation to completion. I washed the dishes and put them away. I wiped the table. I wound the mantel clock and listened to its reliable decision-making. Tick, tick, tick. It had paused at 9:14 when the papers crossed the threshold. Now it remembered how to proceed. As the house grew comfortable around me, I picked up the keys from the bowl by habit and then set them back down, then picked them up again and slipped them into my pocket. They made a familiar weight against my thigh, the kind that reminds you your hand has a place to go when it needs reassurance. Not trophies, not weapons, tools. Before bed, I made one more circuit. The guest room smelled like the perfume she'd packed and the dust she'd stirred. The board under the bed offered its one last honest complaint when I pressed a boot there. The master held a day's warmth the way a good quilt holds memory. On the porch, the rail felt smooth under my palm. The paler rectangle had already learned to belong. I turned off lights with the care of a person who knows how many hours each bulb has given, cracked the bedroom window to invite pine into the night, and lay down under my mother's quilt without thinking about witnesses or filings or who might be telling what story in the city. If I dreamed, I don't remember. Morning came as if the world had been sanded to a fine grit. The lake breathed out, the pines breathed in. The house, our house, took its time choosing the first creak of the day and then gave it, generous and unafraid. Her downfall hadn't been loud. It hadn't asked neighbors to gather. It hadn't required shouting or force or the ugly satisfaction some people mistake for justice. It had sounded like exactly what it was, a correction, a nail set flush, a hinge oiled the night before doing what it was built to do, a plaque removed, holes filled, stain pressed with a thumb until the mark belonged to the wood again. I poured coffee and stood in the doorway with the mug in one hand and the other hand in the pocket that now held the keys. The view was the same as the day before and completely different. I thought of my father then not as a ghost, but as sentences inside my bones. Measure twice. Place the swing. Finish the cut. Don't varnish over dust and call it shine. He hadn't met these statutes and cases. He would have recognized them anyway. He would have set his palm on the rail and said, "There, now it holds." It did. And in the new quiet, the house began to tell me what it wanted next. The first morning after she left, the lake was still. Not just calm in the way water sometimes pauses between winds, but still in a way that made it look like glass cut from gray stone. Sunlight broke gently across its surface, scattering in shards, but the water didn't move. It waited. I carried my coffee to the porch and sat where the boys remembered me. For the first time in years, the house didn't brace against a voice it didn't recognize. It didn't have to. She was gone. It's a strange thing, to live through betrayal, to fight it in silence, and then to wake up one morning without the weight of it pressing against your chest. The air felt thinner, easier to draw. Even the pine trees around the shore seemed to release a longer breath. The house had sighed in relief, and I too let myself exhale. The brass plaque was gone from the porch rail. It had left 4 small holes behind, filled now with putty and stain, but I knew where they were. My hand found them automatically, like a tongue worrying a scar. Mistakes stay in the wood. So do corrections. I'd kept the plaque in the shed, not as a trophy, not even as a warning, just as evidence of how fragile her hold had been. Metal doesn't outlast wood. It only pretends to shine brighter. The real endurance lies in the grain, in the scars that are sanded smooth and made part of the structure. I walked the room slowly that day, touching walls the way you greet old friends. The living room smelled faintly of ash and lemon oil. The mantel clock ticked steadily again after I'd repaired its gears the night she left. Upstairs, the master bedroom was quiet, quilt spread smooth, a rectangle of sunlight falling across the floorboards. The guest room, her room, was bare now. Her perfume had vanished except for a faint trace in the curtains. The board under the bed still groaned when I pressed it with my heel. I left it. Some sounds deserve to remain reminders that intrusions pass, but the house remembered. The photographs in the hallway hadn't moved. My father, hammer in hand, sweat darkening his shirt. Myself, young and sunburned, holding a crooked nail. My children later splattered with stain, painting the deck in streaks that missed as much as they covered. She wasn't in those photographs. Not once. And the house seemed to whisper its agreement. My children came the following weekend. They hadn't been here since the trouble began. They stepped out of their cars slowly, looking around with something like reverence. My daughter paused on the porch, hand grazing the rail. She noticed the fresh stain covering the holes. "It's yours again," she said softly. "It always was," I told her. Now the papers agree. My son walked the dock, running his hand over the planks. He whistled low, shaking his head. "I thought we'd lost this place, Dad." "We almost did," I said, "but almost isn't forever." That evening we grilled on the porch. Smoke and char drifted into the trees, mingling with the scent of pine. The children laughed easily, teasing each other the way they had as kids. Their children, my grandchildren, ran across the yard, chasing dragonflies, their feet pounding the same ground I had pounded at their age. The house listened, pleased. As the sky darkened, my daughter leaned toward me. "Why didn't you fight louder?" she asked. "Why didn't you just expose her from the beginning?" "Because shouting doesn't always fix what's broken," I said. "Sometimes you fix it with patience, with silence, with the right correction in the right place." She didn't answer right away. She just looked around the porch, the yard, the lake, then nodded once, as if the explanation was already written in the boards beneath us. The days settled into a rhythm. Mornings, coffee on the porch, the lake flat and waiting. Afternoons, repairs. I oiled hinges, tightened latches, sanded rails. I fixed the sash cords in the east windows so they opened smooth. I cleaned the gutters she never noticed. Each correction was more than maintenance. It was conversation. The house spoke through complaints, a sticky drawer, a whining hinge, and I answered. Together we reestablished trust. At night, I sat by the fire, the flicker painting the walls in orange and gold. The mantel clock ticked steady. The house breathed. Silence was no longer heavy. It was full. Sometimes I thought of her, not with anger. That had gone the day she drove away. Instead, I wondered what she truly saw when she looked at the house. Did she ever love it? Or did she only love the reflection of herself she thought it gave her? Maybe she believed that possession was love. Maybe she mistook applause for belonging. I'll never know. But I do know this. She never learned the furnace's cough. Never listened to the lake groan in winter. Never recognized the board in the guest room that told you someone was awake at night. She slept in the house, but she never belonged to it. That was her downfall. Ownership without belonging. One morning, sanding the porch rail again, I remembered my father's voice as clearly as if he stood behind me. Don't rush the swing, Richard. Place it. That was how he built the house. Patiently, deliberately. Swing by swing. Nail by nail. And that was how I had reclaimed it. Not with shouting, not with spectacle. With patience, with place corrections. I realized then that my revenge hadn't been mine alone. It had been his too. He built the house. I defended it. We had worked together, just across time. By summer, the house was itself again. The grass grew thick. The dock stood firm. The windows opened smooth. My children returned often, bringing their children. Laughter filled the porch, echoing off the lake. Little feet pounded the boards. Dragonflies darted through air heavy, with the smell of smoke from grilled dinners. One afternoon, my grandson asked why part of the rail looked different, faintly patched. Because something used to be there, I said. Something that didn't belong. I took it off. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to chasing frogs. I smiled. Some lessons don't need full explanations. Sometimes at night, I walk the shoreline. The lake sings its winter song ice cracking, water shifting beneath. I pause by the boundary stones Buckley found and marked. They're solid, moss clinging to their sides, patient as always. I place my hand on them and think about what they've seen. My father's hammer, my bent nails, my children's laughter, my aunt's arrogance, my own silence, and now, my correction. The stones don't move, they don't need to, they remember. So does the house. So do we. People sometimes think victory is loud, that it shouts, humiliates, dominates, but real victory, I've learned, is quiet. It looks like a house breathing easily again. It sounds like a hinge oiled the night before, opening without protest. It feels like keys sitting comfortably in your pocket, not as trophies, not as weapons, but as tools. The true victory isn't that she lost. It's that the house endured. It endured her, it endured me, and it will endure long after both of us are gone. The brass plaque still lies in the shed. I haven't decided what to do with it. Sometimes I think I'll throw it into the lake. Sometimes I think I'll melt it down. Other times I think I'll leave it where it is, gathering dust, so one day my children or grandchildren will find it. If they do, they'll ask what it was, and I'll tell them it was a mistake once screwed into wood. Then I'll point to the rail, smooth and corrected, and say, "But look how we fixed it." That will be enough. Tonight, I sit on the porch with the keys in my pocket. The lake is still again, the stars sharp, the air clean with pine. The house behind me creaks once, content. The mantle clock ticks. The boards remember me. I don't need to speak to her, don't need to answer whatever story she's telling in the city. Silence is my last word, because silence, when placed correctly, is louder than anything else. And tonight, the silence is mine.